The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus and his disciples left from there and began a journey through Galilee, but he did not wish anyone to know about it. He was teaching his disciples and telling them, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him. And 3 days after his death, the Son of Man will rise." But they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to question him. They came to Capernaum, and once inside the house, he began to ask them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they remained silent. They had been discussing among themselves on the way who was the greatest. Then he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "If anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last of all and the servant of all." Taking a child, he placed it in their midst, and putting his arms around it, he said to them, "Whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord. Good morning. Just by looking at me, you probably know that I prefer comfort in my life. I've always said my idea of camping is having to settle for a cheap motel. I love good food, good weather, and so on. But in addition, over the years, I've had some opportunities to go on mission. I've served on mission in China and Russia and Cambodia and a number of other places. One time in particular, I went on mission to Ecuador. We flew into the city of Guayaquil, but then drove a number of hours out into the country. And we arrived at this little village, a little town, into where we were going to work to teach the children and evangelize the people and rebuild their church. When we arrived, we were shown to the place we were going to call home for the next few weeks we were there. It was a shelter previously used for pigs and cattle. It was open air, had a concrete floor, kind of a partial concrete wall, and a tin roof. It was sweltering hot, except when the monsoon caliber thunderstorms came through each night. We were grossly underprepared for where we were staying. I was in my clerical attire, soaked in sweat. And that first night, I curled up in the fetal position on the concrete floor, trying to fit between two chairs I had set up to hold up my mosquito net, hopeful that the scorpions would stay away through the night, praying to my guardian angel the entire time. I remember lying there, unable to sleep, thinking, "What am I doing here? This is the dumbest thing I've ever done. And I've done some really dumb things." Next to us was a small concrete building that had a couple of toilets without doors or seats and didn't flush, at least on their own. It's probably enough of the details, probably, huh? You get what I'm saying? As you might imagine, I became totally engrossed in my own nightmare. I was the victim, and I turned in on myself and my discomfort, and I had to take care of myself. I thought I needed to take care of myself and just survive, if you will. And I turned in on myself, and it stayed that way for a few days. But after a few days, some of the college students who were with us visited a family to preach the gospel. And the family was so grateful that they gave the students one of their chickens. Our students were, how should we say this, very much city folk and had no idea how to butcher a chicken. But a local family who was helping to host us tried to tell one of the students how to wring a chicken's neck. Watching the conversation, especially with the language barrier, I knew this wasn't going to end well. The student tried to imitate the mother of the family as best he could, But a couple of swings later, the head came off in his hand, and the body of the chicken flew across the room, bounced off the wall, and landed on the floor. The whole house went crazy with laughter, even as the students stood there shocked at the foul, evil deed they had just done. We had chicken that night for dinner, and it was absolutely terrible. I'm fairly certain that chicken had been in the original Garden of Eden. It was so old. But that whole moment had a profound effect on me. It really did. It brought me back outside of myself. You know, the gratitude of that family, the gift of a chicken, even an old one, was a significant thing in that place at that time. You know, laughter across cultural boundaries and barriers and language boundaries and barriers. All of that reminded me of why I was there and what I was doing, what we were doing. And it brought my eyes out from myself as the victim and to see them. The entire mission experience changed for me from that moment on. My living conditions didn't change at all. But the more I turned my eyes away from myself, the more joy and peace there was in the work that I was doing and in the services that we were providing. And when I turned my eyes away from myself, I saw Jesus. I saw Jesus. He was there the whole time, but for my own victimhood, the burden of my own cross, gazing upon myself, taking care of myself, fixing myself, I never saw him until I finally could look away. And it's there that I saw him. And I saw him where we lived. I saw him in the people that we served. I had to learn that lesson the hard way in Ecuador. But Jesus, I think, tries to teach us that lesson in our gospel passage this morning. Last week we were in chapter 8 of Mark's gospel, and our gospel skips some verses in chapter 9, and we quickly have another prediction of our Lord's passion and death. So we had last week. This is the second of 3 in Mark's gospel, and it comes in back-to-back weeks because of the verses that are skipped. And this time, notice with the disciples and the apostles, there is no protest to the cross, as there was last week by Peter. But the apostles are still in stunned silence. Jesus' words were simple enough at face value. We might wonder, as we look back, we might wonder what part of "they will kill him" is so hard to understand. Right? That's what he says. But looking back after 2,000 years, maybe not quite 20,000, 2,000 years, it's hard to appreciate how utterly shocking, how counterintuitive, how worldview shattering this idea of a suffering Messiah actually was for the apostles who were with Jesus day in and day out. We can catch a glimpse of understanding when we think about our own reaction to a heavy cross in our life. I'm sure all of you have experienced this before, and you probably experienced it in a similar way that I have. We have that heavy cross in our life all of a sudden, and so often we can be baffled by that trial or that tragedy. Simply, surely this can't be part of God's plan. How could any good come of this? Why me? When all the things that I've been doing, and so on, huh? And we see ourselves only as a victim. We turn in on ourselves so often. I do this all the time and try to protect myself, fix myself in the midst of that burden. And you can see that as this is a hint for us at how the apostles might have felt when Jesus starts talking about the cross, his suffering and death. Then we see them embarrassed that they were discussing along the way which one of them was the greatest. Mark isn't trying to show us the ineptitude of the apostles here. Rather, he wants to remind us of our very human tendency to try to take care of ourselves when a cross is presented to us. The very human tendency to seek our own glory in competition with others, to make sure that we're provided for and taken care of, even at the expense of others, that we're higher than others. He wants to remind us of this tendency, Mark does, when a cross or a trial is presented before us and has brought all that focus upon ourselves. It's no wonder that, having no response to Jesus' prediction of his passion and death, they begin to vie with one another how best to take care of themselves, if you will. Notice Jesus counters by saying, if anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the servant of all. Jesus doesn't say, don't desire to be first. But he's telling them a different way to go about it. I would argue when that cross is presented on our life, it's not that, it's not bad to want to have that security or that peace or that joy or to regain all of that, but he's telling us that we don't get that, we'll never achieve that by what we're looking for simply by self-seeking manipulation of others. Over the next few weeks, Mark will give us a number of examples of how Jesus will guide us through our human tendencies to crave power and pleasure and possessions over the next few weeks. All means by which we typically try to take care of ourselves, especially when we're faced with a cross in our life. Instead of trying to take care of ourselves in moments of trial or tragedy, we can also lift our eyes to the needs of others. And Jesus, remember, last week when he predicted his passion, Jesus reminded us that he will be there. We're to take up our cross, absolutely, but we take up our cross and we follow him. He is present. He's always with us in the midst of those crosses. And this week, in connection with, again, a passion prediction, he reminds us that also what helps us to carry that cross is to lift our eyes in service to other people, to the needs of others. He says it, our translation, to be a servant of all. Now, unfortunately, I would argue in my life, when I hear to be the servant of all, oh, that's a nice platitude. That's beautiful. I need to serve all, everyone. But unfortunately, too often, practically speaking, the servant of all is the servant of no one. We can lift our eyes to the needs of our spouse and our children or our friends. We don't have spouse and children. That's our all. Service to all are those first and foremost right there in the midst of our life that we can be of service to. With our eyes on the service of others, it's then also that we usually see Jesus, who has promised that he would be with us when we carry our cross. But we can actually recognize him, see him when our eyes are lifted off of ourselves. And there he is, present in the midst of our trial or our tragedy, as he always had been from the very first moment. And we have the freedom then to let him bring us joy and peace, even if that cross doesn't go away. On mission in Ecuador or Mexico City, where our parish typically goes on mission, I promise you it's not as bad as what I described. And especially right in our own homes, the service and care of others is the key to flourishing and the key to seeing Jesus. Especially when a cross comes into our life, our eyes need to be still on others, and that will help us to be open to the help of Jesus, even if he doesn't take that cross away. This week, brothers and sisters, I just encourage you, look for ways to serve your spouse. Look for ways to serve your children, even if they're not living at home. Look for ways to help your children serve their siblings. There you will also see Jesus, who is always with us, even as we carry our cross.